Snoop Dogg disguised as a homeless man to check out a luxury restaurant. What happened next will shock you. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and comment where you're watching from. Snoop Dogg leaned back in his chair, the soft glow of the studio lights bouncing off his gold chains. He held a tablet in his hand, scrolling through the latest headlines. Story after story highlighted the same ugly truth. Discrimination and inequality thrived in the shadows of his city, even in its most polished and glamorous corners. One headline struck him like a blow: "Homeless veteran evicted from upscale restaurant. We don't serve people like you." Snoop's brow furrowed. He felt a familiar pang in his chest, the same one he'd felt growing up in Long Beach, watching his neighbors struggle just to make it through the week. This wasn't just another story to scroll past. It felt personal. He'd made it big, earned respect and riches, but he couldn't shake the memories of what it was like to be looked down upon because of where you came from, or how you looked. He set the tablet down, the words still echoing in his mind. "We don't serve people like you." The thought simmered, turning into a spark of an idea. What would happen, he wondered, if someone like him, someone with wealth, fame, and power, stripped all that away? What if he walked in the shoes of those who were turned away and ignored? Would the world treat him differently if it didn't know who he was? The idea began to take shape. He called in his closest confidant, Dre, and laid it all out. "Man, I've been reading about how folks get treated out here," Snoop said, pacing the room. "They see someone struggling, someone down on their luck, and they don't even treat them like humans. I'm thinking, what if I put myself out there, see it firsthand? No cameras, no entourage, just me out there in the real world." Dre leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You sure about this? That ain't just a stunt, Snoop. You're gonna see some real ugly stuff." "That's exactly why I gotta do it," Snoop replied, his voice steady. "People need to see what's going on, but they won't believe it unless someone like me shows them. And I need to see it too." Dre studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but if you're gonna do this, you gotta do it right. No shortcuts. You gotta live it." Snoop smiled grimly. "That's the plan." The next day, Snoop began his transformation. He went through his closet, finding the most worn-out clothes he had. None of them were convincing enough. He needed to blend in, to disappear into the background. A trip to a thrift store solved that problem. He picked out a pair of faded jeans with frayed edges, a tattered hoodie, and a pair of scuffed sneakers. Back home, he added the finishing touches. His makeup artist worked magic, adding shadows under his eyes and smudges of dirt to his skin. A prosthetic scar stretched across his cheek, giving him a hardened, weathered look. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. "Damn," he muttered, running a hand over his face. "I look like I've been through it." "That's the point," the makeup artist said with a small smile. The last piece of the puzzle was his mindset. Snoop sat alone in his studio, closing his eyes and letting the memories of his childhood flood back. He thought about the times he'd gone hungry, the times he'd felt invisible. He needed to channel that feeling, to walk back into that place mentally. Only then would the experiment be real. His first night on the streets was an education. The air was colder than he expected, cutting through the thin layers of his hoodie. He wandered aimlessly, taking in the city from a new perspective. The bright lights of downtown felt harsh, the towering buildings impersonal. Everywhere he went, he felt the weight of people's gazes, or their lack of them. Some looked at him with pity, others with disdain. Most didn't look at all. It was the invisibility that hit him hardest. He passed by a group of well-dressed young professionals laughing on their way to a rooftop bar. They didn't even glance his way, as if he were a part of the pavement. By midnight, he found himself at a makeshift encampment under a freeway overpass. A small fire crackled in the center, surrounded by a handful of people. Snoop approached cautiously, unsure of how he'd be received. "Got room for one more?" he asked, his voice low. An older man with a weathered face and kind eyes nodded. "Pull up a crate. You new around here?" "Something like that," Snoop replied, sitting down. The man introduced himself as Carl, a former construction worker who'd lost everything after a workplace injury. Around the fire, others shared their stories. A young woman who'd fled an abusive home, a veteran struggling with PTSD, a man who'd lost his job and couldn't get back on his feet. Each story was a reminder of how thin the line was between stability and despair. Snoop listened intently, his heart heavy. These weren't just statistics, they were people, each with their own struggles and dreams. He shared a little about himself, too, carefully crafting a backstory that felt true to the character he was playing. As the fire burned low, he leaned back and looked up at the stars, barely visible through the haze of the city. He thought about how far he'd come, and how far he still had to go. This was only the beginning. By morning, Snoop felt like he'd lived a lifetime. He walked aimlessly through the city, observing the rhythms of life around him. He noticed the small cruelties, the way people crossed the street to avoid him, the way shopkeepers watched him like a hawk if he stepped too close to their displays. But he also noticed moments of kindness. A woman handing out sandwiches to a group of homeless men. A man stopping to give someone $1 and a smile. These small acts gave him hope, even as the weight of the experiment settled on his shoulders. The idea of visiting an upscale restaurant began to take shape in his mind. He'd seen enough to know how people treated those who had nothing. Now, he wanted to see how they treated someone they deemed unworthy of being in their space. As he walked past a glittering five-star restaurant in the heart of downtown, he paused, staring at the polished glass doors. This would be the place. But not yet. He needed to observe more, to fully understand the world he was stepping into. He walked away, his resolve hardening with every step. The mask of poverty wasn't just a disguise, it was a key to unlocking the truth, and he was ready to use it. Snoop stood outside the restaurant's gleaming glass doors, his reflection staring back at him. The sight almost made him hesitate. He looked nothing like himself. No chains, no tailored clothes, no air of effortless confidence. Instead, he saw what the world saw now. A man worn down by life, unkempt and tired, a face that people crossed the street to avoid. The previous night's experiences had left their mark. Sleeping on the hard concrete, the chill cutting through his thin clothes, the constant fear of being robbed or attacked, it had been more than uncomfortable. It had been humbling. But it also steeled his resolve. He exhaled slowly and pulled the hood of his faded sweatshirt tighter around his face. He stepped forward and pushed open the door. The shift in atmosphere hit him immediately. The air inside was perfumed with truffle oil and aged wine. Soft, classical music floated through the space, the clinking of silverware and glass adding to the ambiance of quiet luxury. The lighting was dim but carefully arranged to highlight the elegant decor. Polished marble floors, velvet chairs, and chandeliers that seemed too delicate to be real. Heads turned almost instantly. Conversations faltered, replaced by whispers. A man in a crisp navy suit leaned toward his date, muttering something that made her glance at Snoop before quickly looking away. A group of young women at the bar stifled laughter, one of them taking a discreet photo with her phone. Snoop kept his eyes forward, walking toward the hostess stand. He felt the weight of every stare, every hushed word. "Can I help you?" The hostess looked up from her reservation book, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes giving her away. Annoyance, discomfort, and just a hint of fear. She was young, no older than 25, with flawless makeup and a tailored black dress that seemed more expensive than anything Snoop was wearing combined. "Yeah," Snoop said, his voice roughened by exhaustion and the role he was playing. "I'd like a table." Her eyes flicked down to his clothes, lingering on the dirt smudges and frayed edges. She hesitated, and Snoop saw the internal battle written all over her face. Finally, she plastered on a tight smile. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're fully booked for the evening." He glanced past her at the dining area. Half the tables were empty. He turned back, raising an eyebrow. "Doesn't look that way to me." She faltered but quickly recovered, straightening her shoulders. "We're expecting reservations to fill those tables soon," she said, her voice sharper this time. "I'm afraid we can't accommodate walk-ins tonight." Snoop leaned against the counter, keeping his voice calm. "I can pay," he said, pulling out a worn leather wallet and opening it just enough to reveal crisp $100 bills. Cash. Her eyes widened slightly before narrowing. She stepped back, folding her arms. "I'm sorry, sir," she said again, louder this time, drawing the attention of more guests. "But I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Snoop felt his stomach tighten. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the tone, the way she spoke to him like he was dirt, something unpleasant that needed to be swept out the door. "Excuse me?" The manager appeared, summoned by the tension. He was tall and lean, his hair slicked back, his suit perfectly tailored. He didn't look at Snoop directly. "Is there a problem here?" "No problem," the hostess replied quickly. "I was just explaining to this gentleman that we're fully booked tonight." Snoop locked eyes with the manager, hoping to find some sign of empathy or understanding. Instead, he saw calculation, a quick assessment, followed by dismissal. "Sir, if you don't have a reservation, I'm afraid you'll need to leave," the manager said, his tone cold and professional. "We have a dress code and a standard to uphold." Snoop felt heat rise in his chest. He knew this was part of the plan, but the anger felt real. He wasn't just playing a role anymore. This was personal. "I've got the money to pay," he said, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "And I don't see no sign on your door saying only rich folks get to eat here." The manager's lips tightened. "I'm asking you to leave," he said. "Now." Two security guards appeared at his sides, and Snoop felt the tension shift. The guards didn't need to say anything. Their presence alone was enough. Snoop took a step back, his hands raised. "All right," he said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "I'm going." He turned and walked out, feeling the stairs burn into his back. The moment the doors shut behind him, the sound of laughter and conversation resumed, louder than before. Outside, Snoop leaned against the brick wall and let the anger simmer. He pulled out his phone and texted Dre. "They did exactly what I thought they'd do." The reply came almost instantly. "Keep going. They're showing their true colors." Snoop slipped his phone back into his pocket. He wasn't done yet. He didn't leave. Instead, he stayed nearby, watching the restaurant from a distance. He saw the same hostess greet other guests with warm smiles, watched as men in designer suits were shown to tables without question. At one point, he saw a man who looked only slightly better dressed than Snoop had been. Jeans and a blazer, no tie. But he was white, and that was enough. He was seated within minutes. The truth was as ugly as Snoop had expected. It wasn't just about money, it was about image, about race, about who people thought deserved to be treated with respect. By the time the police arrived, called in by the restaurant staff, Snoop was ready for them. He stayed calm as they questioned him, his hands raised to show he wasn't a threat. "You're loitering," one officer said, his voice flat. "The restaurant called and said you were harassing their staff." Snoop stared at him, trying to keep his voice steady. "I wasn't harassing anyone," he said. "I tried to eat there, and they wouldn't let me." The officer didn't care. He motioned to the car. "Come on, let's go." Snoop let them lead him away, his heart pounding. This was the part he'd been dreading, the part where his plan crossed into dangerous territory. But as they pushed him into the back seat of the squad car, he felt something else too. Determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The hum of the police cruiser was the only sound filling the space. Snoop sat in the back seat, staring through the bars on the window at the city rolling by. The world outside looked different now, harsher, colder. Each flickering streetlight cast shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing alleys and sidewalks. The officer driving didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence carried its own weight, one that Snoop recognized. It was the kind of silence meant to remind you where you stood, outside the lines, out of place. They didn't take him far. The car stopped at the edge of downtown, near the border where polished storefronts gave way to crumbling brick buildings and graffiti-stained alleyways. The officer stepped out, opened the back door, and gestured for Snoop to get out. He complied, stepping onto the cracked sidewalk. The officer didn't even make eye contact before slamming the door and driving away, leaving Snoop standing alone in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. The street was almost empty, save for a few figures huddled near a bus stop, bench, and another lying beneath a ragged blanket in the doorway of an abandoned shop. The air smelled of urine and stale beer, layered over the distant scent of exhaust fumes. Snoop pulled his hoodie tighter, the night's chill settling into his bones. He walked slowly, taking in his surroundings. The city looked different from this angle, not as a stage for performances or red carpet events, but as a place that swallowed people whole and forgot about them. The bench ahead creaked as one of the figures shifted. A woman, no older than 25, sat with her arms wrapped around her knees. Her hair hung in tangled strands and her eyes were fixed on something far away. Snoop paused. He thought about the restaurant, the way they'd looked at him, pushed him out like garbage. He wondered how long it had been since anyone looked at this woman like a person. She didn't acknowledge him as he sat down at the far end of the bench. He didn't say anything, didn't want to startle her. Instead, he let the silence stretch, listening to the occasional hiss of passing cars and the low hum of a distant generator. It took several minutes before she glanced his way, her eyes wary. "They let you out?" she asked, her voice raspy. Snoop nodded. "They always let you out if you're not important enough to keep," she said. Her tone wasn't bitter, just tired. He looked at her more closely, noticing the bruises along her arms, the dirt under her nails. She had the look of someone who'd been running for a long time, with nowhere left to go. Snoop didn't press her for more. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the last $20 bill he'd brought with him. He held it out, waiting until she finally took it. Her fingers trembled as she tucked it into her sleeve. She didn't thank him, but she didn't need to. The way her shoulders relaxed said enough. As she stood and walked away, Snoop felt the weight of the night settle deeper. This wasn't just an experiment anymore. These people weren't props in a performance. They were lives, unraveling thread by thread. The night dragged on. Snoop wandered from block to block, watching the city transform. In the daylight, these streets were alive with people rushing to work, shopping, meeting friends. But at night, the cracks showed. He passed clusters of tents pitched against chain-link fences, their nylon walls fluttering in the breeze. He saw makeshift shelters built from pallets and cardboard, some with flickering candles inside. The faces that emerged from the shadows were weary, hollow. Outside a 24-hour diner, he lingered, watching the glow of neon reflect off the sidewalk. Inside, people laughed and ate, their plates piled high with food. Snoop's stomach growled, but he ignored it. Hunger was part of this now, another layer of the experience. A man sitting on the curb caught his eye. His clothes were in worse shape than Snoop's, and his face was gaunt, cheeks sunken. He held a cardboard sign with the words, "Anything helps," scrawled in shaky letters. Snoop approached and sat beside him. For the next hour, he listened to the man talk about losing his job, about his wife leaving, about the day he stopped trying to climb back up. The words poured out like water breaking through a dam. Snoop didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice or promises. He just sat and listened, letting the man's story hang in the air between them. When the man finally fell silent, Snoop stood, pulling a folded bill from his pocket and slipping it into the man's cup. "Keep pushing," he said softly before walking away. By dawn, exhaustion had settled deep into Snoop's bones. He found an alley with a dry corner and sat down, leaning his head against the wall. The concrete was cold and his body ached, but he forced himself to stay awake, watching the city come alive again. The first light of morning revealed the details he'd missed in the dark. The graffiti that covered every surface, the broken glass scattered along the sidewalk, the crumpled beer cans and cigarette butts. A street cleaner rumbled past, its brushes sweeping dirt and trash into neat rows. It didn't stop for the people still huddled in sleeping bags. Snoop closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the machine fade into the background. He thought about the restaurant again, about the manager's cold stare and the laughter that followed him out the door. It wasn't just the food they denied him, it was dignity. And as he sat there, surrounded by the echoes of a city that didn't care, he knew the next step was clear. He would go back. But this time, he wouldn't be alone. By midday, Snoop found his way back to the encampment he'd visited the night before. Carl was still there, tending to a small fire and boiling water in a dented pot. Snoop sat beside him and laid out his plan. He didn't tell Carl who he was. He didn't need to. What mattered was the idea. "We can't keep letting them treat us like this," Snoop said. Carl nodded slowly. "It's been that way for a long time. What makes you think you can change it?" Snoop looked out at the city, his jaw tightening. "Because I have to." As the fire crackled and the smell of cheap coffee filled the air, Snoop knew he wasn't done yet. He had seen the world's cracks up close, and now he was ready to break them wide open. The midday sun bore down on the street as Snoop Dogg made his way back toward the restaurant. He was no longer hunched under the weight of exhaustion or insecurity. His steps were deliberate, each one a reminder of why he had started this journey. The previous night's cold still clung to his bones, but it was overshadowed by the heat of determination burning inside him. The city moved around him as though he didn't exist. Businessmen passed with briefcases and Bluetooth earpieces, lost in their own conversations. Couples in designer clothes strolled by, pausing to glance into store windows, their reflections shimmering alongside displays of diamonds and leather handbags. No one noticed him. At least, no one wanted to. It was a pattern Snoop had come to expect. He had spent enough time on the streets now to understand the rhythm of invisibility. People didn't ignore him out of malice. It was fear. Fear of acknowledging the fragility of their own security. Fear that looking too closely at someone else's suffering might force them to confront their own humanity. But today, Snoop wasn't here to be ignored. He stood outside the restaurant, staring through the same glass doors that had shut him out days earlier. The memory of that night lingered, the sharp glances, the manager's thinly veiled contempt, the security guards closing in like wolves. He hadn't forgotten any of it. The restaurant looked just as polished as before. Inside, patrons laughed over plates of pasta and seared steaks. Wine glasses caught the light, glinting like jewels. It was a world that felt so far removed from the alleyways and encampments he had come to know, and yet it was just a few blocks away. This time, he wasn't walking through those doors alone. Behind him stood a small group of people he had met on the streets. Carl, the weathered construction worker who had lost everything after an accident. Rosa, the young woman who had fled an abusive home only to find herself sleeping under bridges. And Darnell, a veteran whose PTSD had pushed him to the edge of society. They didn't look like customers. They wore the same clothes they had slept in, their faces marked by fatigue and uncertainty. But they stood tall, following Snoop's lead. Snoop pulled off his hoodie, letting the disguise fall away. He straightened his posture, rolled back his shoulders, and stepped forward. The transition was subtle but powerful. The weight of the past few days still clung to him, but his presence shifted. He wasn't just another man on the street anymore. The hostess from before looked up as he entered. Her eyes widened in recognition, and for a moment, she seemed unsure of how to react. The man who had been turned away and escorted out was now standing before her in a tailored suit, his chain glinting under the lights. Her voice wavered. "Sir, welcome back. May I—" "You remember me?" Snoop interrupted, his tone calm but firm. She opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated. "I was here 2 nights ago," he continued, stepping closer to the counter. "I walked through those doors just like I did today. Only difference, I didn't look like this." Her eyes darted to the group standing behind him. "I asked for a table," Snoop said, lowering his voice, but making sure it carried. "I had money. I was polite. And you turned me away." The manager appeared then, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. He moved quickly to the counter, positioning himself between Snoop and the hostess. "I'm sorry, sir, but—" "Don't," Snoop cut him off. "Don't apologize. Not yet." The room had gone silent. Conversations had stopped, and every set of eyes was now fixed on the unfolding scene. Snoop turned to the group behind him and motioned for them to step forward. "You see these people?" he said, addressing the room. "They're human beings, just like you, just like me. But this place," he gestured around him, "this place treated me like trash because I didn't look the part. And I know I'm not the only one." The manager's face paled. "Sir, I assure you we—" "Stop," Snoop said sharply, and the manager fell silent. He pulled out his phone and held it up. "I recorded everything," he said, "every word, every look, and I'm not here to shame you. I'm here to fix this." The crowd murmured. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious. The staff shifted nervously, unsure of what would happen next. "I'm buying this place," Snoop said. "Starting today, it's under new ownership." The manager blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me," Snoop said. "I'm buying it, and I'm changing it." He turned back to the group he had brought with him. "This is Carl," he said, pointing to the older man who stepped forward hesitantly. "He helped build half this city, but when he got hurt, no one gave a damn. That ends today." He moved to Rosa. "This is Rosa. She ran from something worse than most of you will ever know, and instead of finding safety, she found closed doors." Finally, he pointed to Darnell. "And this man? He fought for this country. And what did he get? Nights on the street and strangers crossing the road to avoid him." Snoop turned back to the crowd. "You see them now? You can't look away this time." The room was silent. Even the manager had nothing to say. Snoop stepped back, pulling out his phone again. "This is live," he said. "Millions of people are watching this right now, watching you, watching me, watching them." And then he smiled, not out of arrogance, but out of conviction. "This place is gonna change," he said. "Not just the name, not just the menu, everything." He turned to the group and gestured toward the tables. "Now, let's eat." Carl, Rosa, and Darnell hesitated, but when Snoop nodded, they followed him. They sat down at the same tables where, days earlier, others had sneered and laughed at their kind. Waiters stood frozen until Snoop gave a sharp nod. Then, slowly, they moved, bringing menus, water, and silverware. Outside the restaurant, the crowd had started to gather. People pressed against the windows, snapping photos, recording videos. The moment had already begun to spread. And Snoop knew this was just the beginning. He leaned back in his chair as plates began to arrive, his mind already turning to the next step. The world had seen the mask. Now it was time for them to see what lay underneath. The restaurant had closed its doors for the last time under its old name. By the following morning, the gilded sign above the entrance had been taken down, leaving behind faint shadows of letters that spelled out the past. Snoop stood outside, staring at the blank space. The emptiness didn't bother him. It felt like possibility, like a clean slate waiting for something new to be written. The windows had been covered with paper, hiding the interior while renovations began. Workers in paint-splattered clothes moved in and out, carrying tools, rolls of fabric, and stacks of lumber. The air was thick with the smell of sawdust and fresh paint. Snoop walked inside, weaving between ladders and stacks of chairs pushed against the walls. The transformation was already underway. Gone were the chandeliers and velvet curtains, symbols of exclusion and excess. In their place, warm wood and bright colors started to emerge. Long communal tables replaced the isolated, candlelit booths, inviting conversation instead of separation. The walls, once blank and sterile, now showcased murals painted by local artists, scenes of resilience, strength, and diversity. Snoop had spent the past week working with designers and planners, pushing for every detail to reflect the restaurant's new mission. He wanted it to feel open, welcoming to anyone who walked through the doors. The lighting had to be warm, the seating comfortable but unpretentious. Even the kitchen, previously hidden behind swinging doors, was opened up with glass panels so guests could see the chefs at work. The change wasn't just aesthetic. The staff was new too. Instead of polished servers plucked from high-end hotels, Snoop had hired people with stories like Carl's and Rosa's. People who had been pushed aside, overlooked, or turned away too many times. Carl was the first to sign on. He'd arrived early that morning, dressed in borrowed work clothes and looking more nervous than Snoop had ever seen him. His hands shook as he tightened bolts on a newly assembled table, but Snoop didn't step in. He let Carl work through it, knowing the man needed to prove, to himself more than anyone else, that he belonged here. Rosa arrived a little later. She'd already started training as a hostess, her posture straighter than it had been the day they met. She had a clipboard tucked under one arm and a pen behind her ear, jotting down details about reservations and deliveries. Her face still carried traces of exhaustion, but her eyes were brighter now, more alive. Darnell showed up with a duffel bag and a quiet nod. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. He'd taken to the kitchen immediately, his focus sharp as he organized utensils and prepped ingredients. Watching him move, Snoop saw the discipline of a soldier, but also the fragility of someone still fighting battles no one else could see. The work wasn't easy. There were delays with permits, arguments over budgets, and moments when it felt like the vision was slipping out of reach. Snoop spent long hours at the site, reviewing blueprints, overseeing deliveries, and meeting with the contractors. The nights were worse. He often found himself lying awake, replaying the doubts people had voiced when he first announced his plan. Critics called it a stunt. The media questioned whether it was all for publicity. Even some of Snoop's friends had warned him that changing one restaurant wouldn't change the world. But it wasn't about changing the world. It was about creating a space that proved change was possible. As the days blurred together, the restaurant began to take shape. The mural was finished first, a sprawling collage of faces and symbols that told stories of struggle and triumph. One section featured Rosa's handprints, layered over Carl's fingerprints, representing resilience and rebuilding. Another showed silhouettes of soldiers marching toward the horizon, a tribute to Darnell and others like him. The tables came next, each one carved with words donated by guests and supporters. Some were names of loved ones lost to addiction or violence. Others were phrases like, "Hope lives here," and "Everyone deserves a seat." Snoop insisted on trying every dish on the new menu. The food had to match the mission. Bold flavors, simple ingredients, and no pretension. He worked closely with the chefs, testing spices, adjusting portions, and making sure every plate told a story. By the time opening day approached, the transformation was complete. The old restaurant had been stripped away, replaced by something new, not just in appearance but in purpose. On the eve of the grand opening, Snoop stood in the empty dining room taking it all in. The lights cast soft shadows across the tables. The mural glowed under spotlights, and the kitchen hummed with quiet energy as the staff prepared for the next day. Carl wiped down the counters, his movements steady now. Rosa double-checked the reservation list, occasionally pausing to smooth her uniform. Darnell polished the silverware, his focus unwavering. Snoop felt a pang of pride watching them. They weren't the same people he'd met on the streets. They had grown, changed, and stepped into roles no one had thought they could fill, including themselves. Outside, the crowd was already gathering. News crews set up cameras and passers-by stopped to peek through the windows. Word had spread quickly, fueled by social media and whispers of curiosity. Snoop knew there would be critics, people ready to pick apart every decision, waiting for the moment things went wrong. But he didn't care. This wasn't for them. It was for Carl and Rosa and Darnell, for everyone who had ever been turned away or told they didn't belong. As he locked up for the night, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Tomorrow wasn't just about opening a restaurant. It was about proving that the doors would stay open for everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from. The thought stayed with him as he walked home through the quiet streets. He passed the same alleyways and bus stops where he'd slept days earlier, but they felt different now. The shadows seemed less overwhelming, the cold a little less sharp. He paused outside one of the encampments, watching as a man zipped up a sleeping bag and settled in for the night. Snoop reached into his pocket and pulled out a flyer for the grand opening. He placed it next to the man, careful not to wake him. Then he walked away, the glow of the restaurant lights fading behind him. Tomorrow, everything would change, or at least it would start to. The morning of the grand opening arrived with a tension that felt almost tangible. Snoop Dogg stood outside the restaurant, hands in his pockets, as the sun climbed above the skyline. The building looked ready. New signage gleamed above the door, the windows shone, and the smell of fresh paint still lingered faintly in the air. But it wasn't the building that concerned him. It was everything waiting beyond its walls, the questions, the criticism, and the weight of expectations. Word about the opening had spread far beyond the local community. Reporters lined the sidewalks, microphones and cameras ready. Social media buzzed with hashtags, debates, and predictions. Some people praised the restaurant's mission, calling it a symbol of hope. Others accused Snoop of turning poverty into a publicity stunt, questioning whether his involvement was genuine or just another performance. Snoop had prepared himself for the backlash. He knew people would doubt him, but their doubts didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was making sure the doors stayed open, no matter how loud the critics got. Inside, the final preparations were underway. Rosa checked the seating arrangements, occasionally wiping her hands on her apron as nerves got the better of her. Carl adjusted table settings, lining up silverware with the precision of a man determined not to let his second chance slip away. Darnell moved through the kitchen, his focus sharp as he directed the other cooks, his voice steady even as the pressure mounted. They weren't the same people Snoop had met on the streets. In just a few short weeks, they had transformed. But as the first guests began to arrive, he saw flashes of uncertainty in their eyes. They knew what was at stake. The opening started smoothly. Guests trickled in, some curious, some skeptical, but the atmosphere stayed warm. The food came out perfectly, and the staff worked like a team that had been together for years. Snoop lingered in the background, letting the space speak for itself. But as the crowd grew, so did the tension. Not everyone had come to celebrate. A group of protesters gathered outside holding signs that read, "No stunts, no exploitation, and equality can't be bought." Their chants rose above the noise of the street, drawing the attention of passers-by and cameras. Snoop stepped outside to face them. He didn't flinch when the shouting grew louder. Instead, he stood quietly, letting their words hang in the air. He recognized some of their arguments. He had thought about the same questions himself. Could a single restaurant really make a difference? Or was it just another distraction, another headline that would fade in a week? But when one protester accused him of using people's suffering to boost his image, Snoop felt something snap. He stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't do this for headlines," he said. "I did this because people like you keep saying nothing can change, and I'm tired of hearing it." The crowd quieted for a moment, but the tension didn't break. Back inside, the pressure was building. A group of critics had taken seats near the center of the dining room, their conversations loud enough to draw attention. They picked apart the food, criticized the decor, and questioned whether the staff were really qualified to work there. Carl dropped a glass, the sound sharp and sudden. He froze, his hands shaking, but Darnell stepped in quickly, clearing the shards and calming him down. Rosa kept her head high, but Snoop could see her stealing nervous glances toward the critics. He knew this wasn't just about the food or the service. It was about proving that the people society had written off could rise to the occasion. And he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from them. Snoop stepped forward, moving through the tables until he reached the critics. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You're not here for the food," he said, looking each of them in the eye. "You're here to see if we fail, but we're not going to." The critics exchanged glances, but none of them spoke. Snoop turned back to the rest of the room, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "This place isn't about perfection," he said. "It's about second chances. And if you can't see that, you're the ones who don't belong here." Applause rippled through the room, small at first but growing louder. Rosa smiled for the first time that day. Carl straightened his shoulders. Darnell kept working, but Snoop saw the corner of his mouth lift in satisfaction. Outside, the protesters started to disperse, and the crowd inside began to settle. But the day wasn't over yet. By the afternoon, news crews were streaming in and out of the restaurant. Interviews took place in corners and by the windows, microphones and cameras capturing every detail. Snoop answered their questions carefully, emphasizing the mission behind the restaurant and the people who had made it possible. But he also made it clear that this wasn't the end. "This is just one place," he said. "One step. But if we can make it work here, we can make it work anywhere." The media didn't let up. Some focused on the positive stories, the staff, the food, the transformation. Others dug deeper, questioning whether the restaurant could survive long term or if it would collapse once the attention faded. Snoop didn't let it shake him. He knew the doubts would keep coming, but he also knew the people inside, the ones who had fought their way off the streets, weren't going to quit. As the sun set, the restaurant began to empty. The staff cleaned up, their movements slower but more confident. Carl wiped down tables, his hands steady. Rosa counted tips, her smile growing with each bill she added to the stack. Darnell leaned against the counter, his exhaustion visible but his pride even more so. Snoop stepped outside, taking a deep breath as the night air cooled. The protesters were gone. The critics had moved on, but the glow from inside the restaurant remained, casting light onto the sidewalk. He knew this was only the first battle. There would be more protests, more criticism, more doubts, but the doors were open, and they were going to stay that way. As he walked toward his car, he passed a man sitting on the curb, clutching a tattered blanket. Without hesitation, Snoop pulled out his wallet and handed him a card, the restaurant's card. "Come by tomorrow," he said. "Lunch is on me." The man stared at the card, then back at Snoop, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Seriously?" Snoop nodded. "Everyone deserves a seat at the table," he said. And as he walked away, the glow of the restaurant lights stayed with him, a reminder that the fight for truth wasn't over, but it had begun. The night after the grand opening, Snoop Dogg sat alone in the restaurant long after the last table had been cleared and the lights dimmed. The quiet hummed around him, broken only by the faint clatter of dishes being washed in the back. The day had been a success, or at least that's how it looked from the outside. The critics hadn't been able to bring the place down, and the protesters had left without making a scene. The staff had risen to the challenge, delivering meals and service with pride, and the media had broadcast the story far and wide. But as Snoop sat at one of the communal tables, the glow of the mural casting shadows along the walls, he felt the weight of what still lay ahead. Opening the doors was only the first step. Keeping them open, that was the real battle. The night lingered in his mind. He thought about Carl, whose hands had trembled under the weight of his first real job in years. He thought about Rosa, whose confidence had cracked under the pressure before she found her footing. And he thought about Darnell, who had kept his composure even as cameras hovered around him, but whose eyes betrayed the fear that this second chance might not last. Snoop leaned back, letting his eyes trace the outlines of the mural. It told stories of survival, resilience, and hope, but it also served as a reminder of how fragile those things could be. He couldn't let this place become another failed attempt at change. It had to last. By morning, the world outside the restaurant had already begun to shift. News vans were gone, replaced by curious locals and tourists drawn by the buzz. The staff arrived early, their faces showing traces of exhaustion, but also something else: pride. Carl went straight to work, cleaning tables and adjusting chairs without waiting for instructions. Rosa greeted customers with a steadiness she hadn't shown before, her voice clear and welcoming. Darnell moved through the kitchen like a man with something to prove, his focus sharp as he led the team through another day of service. But as the day wore on, Snoop saw the cracks beginning to form. The attention brought more than just customers. It brought expectations. Every plate was scrutinized, every interaction judged. Critics returned, this time posing as regular guests, ready to pounce on the smallest mistake. Carl dropped a tray of glasses. Rosa fumbled with the seating chart. Darnell snapped at one of the younger cooks. The tension built slowly, threatening to undo everything they had worked for. Snoop stepped in when he needed to, helping Carl clean up, calming Rosa, and pulling Darnell aside to remind him what they were fighting for. But he knew this wasn't sustainable. They needed more than just inspiration. They needed structure. That night, after the doors closed, Snoop gathered the staff. They sat around the largest table, their faces reflecting the exhaustion of the day. He didn't sugarcoat it. He told them the truth, that this wouldn't get easier anytime soon, that people would keep doubting them, keep waiting for them to fail. But he also reminded them of what they'd already survived. Carl had lived through years of injuries and homelessness. Rosa had escaped a nightmare and rebuilt herself. Darnell had faced battles no one else could see. "If we can survive that," Snoop said, his voice low but steady, "we can survive this." The room fell silent, but Snoop saw the shift in their eyes. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had been replaced by something stronger. Over the next few weeks, the restaurant found its rhythm. Word spread quickly, not just about the food, but about the story behind it. Customers came from all over, some out of curiosity, others out of solidarity. Celebrities stopped by, posting photos and praising the mission. Donations poured in, helping cover costs and fund future expansions. But not everyone supported the cause. Articles surfaced accusing Snoop of exploiting his staff for publicity. Online trolls questioned whether the employees were really qualified or if their backgrounds were just being used as marketing tools. Snoop didn't respond to every attack, but he didn't ignore them either. Instead, he focused on letting the work speak for itself. He invited skeptics to visit, to see the restaurant in action and talk to the staff. Most left with their doubts silenced. The turning point came when Carl was interviewed for a local news segment. Sitting in the dining room he'd helped build, Carl told his story. how he'd lost everything after an injury, how he'd spent years trying to climb out of the hole, and how this restaurant had given him a chance when no one else would. His words resonated far beyond the city. Calls and emails poured in from people who saw themselves in his story. Some asked how they could help. Others asked how they could find similar opportunities in their own communities. The momentum grew. Snoop started hosting events at the restaurant, fundraisers for shelters, job fairs for people looking for second chances, and workshops led by the staff to help others develop skills and confidence. The protests stopped. The critics grew quieter. And the restaurant became something more than a place to eat. It became a movement. But even as the success grew, Snoop never forgot the people who had inspired it. He kept visiting the streets where it all started, handing out flyers and free meal vouchers, talking to the people who were still waiting for their chance. On one of those nights, he ran into the young woman he'd met at the bus stop on his first night out. She was still there, sitting on the same bench, but this time her posture was different. She looked up as he approached, recognition flashing in her eyes. "I saw you on TV," she said quietly. Snoop handed her a flyer. "You ready for a change?" She took it, her fingers trembling slightly. "Maybe," she said. "That's enough," Snoop replied. Months passed, and the restaurant continued to thrive. New staff members were hired, each with their own story of struggle and survival. Some stayed, building new lives. Others moved on, carrying what they'd learned into new opportunities. Snoop knew the work wasn't done. He had plans for more restaurants, more spaces where people could find dignity and purpose. But as he stood in the dining room one evening, watching Carl joke with customers, Rosa led a training session for new hires, and Darnell teach a teenager how to chop vegetables, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The flame of change had been lit, and as long as people were willing to keep it alive, it would keep burning. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and leave your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to check out the other videos on the channel. There are even more interesting stories.